The topic of our panel today is one of the most deserving of our close analysis. And indeed, in my view, it's at the core of Egypt's transition. The state of human rights and the rule of law is a barometer for the political direction of Egypt. And unfortunately, it's not a pretty picture. As we know, it was citizen outrage over sustained violations of human rights under the Mubarak regime that was one of the key drivers of the revolution. And its ongoing anger over human rights abuses, in some cases, perhaps even more than anger over the deteriorating economic situation that continues to fuel protest and instability in Egypt today. The failure to achieve or even to begin systemic reform of the legal framework and the political framework for human rights and the rule of law in Egypt has been, to many Egyptians and to many outside observers, one of the biggest surprises and biggest disappointments of post-Mubarak Egypt. And amidst ongoing street protests that are roiling Egypt from the north of the country to the south, the authorities have struggled to propose a way forward that maintains public security, which Egyptians want, and that also protects human rights, which Egyptians also want. A statement issued last week by a consortium of 21 of Egypt's top human rights groups said, and this is somewhat remarkable if you stop to think about it, the human rights situation in Egypt currently appears even more dire than it did prior to the revolution and the ouster of the former president. The country has merely traded one form of authoritarianism for another, albeit with some new features. Today, to provide detailed insights into the human rights situation and explore whether this statement that I just read you is accurate, and to help us understand what Egyptians and the international community can do regarding Egypt's human rights situation, we're very fortunate to have with us today from Cairo two of the most incisive and respected analysts of Egypt's political scene, Heba Morayef and Mahmoud Salem. Heba is the Egypt Director for Human Rights Watch, where she investigates, analyzes, and conducts advocacy against human rights abuses in Egypt. She has a significant human rights background, having previously worked for Amnesty International, Article 19, and the United Nations Development Program. Mahmoud, who's better known, I think, to all of us as Sand Monkey, his blogging moniker, is a blogger, an activist, and a very important analyst of the Egyptian political scene. And he was brave enough to be a candidate in last year's parliamentary elections in Heliopolis.
Right.
If you have not heard it, I definitely recommend listening to the podcast on Arabist.net, in which Mahmoud talks about his experience as a candidate and as a campaign manager. That podcast provides very, very interesting insights into real politics of Egypt. So Heba and Mahmoud will each speak for about 10 minutes. And following their presentations, Tarek Radwan, who's the Associate Director for Research here at the Hariri Center, will provide some reaction to their remarks, and then we'll open up to questions from all of you. So with that, I will turn to Heba.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you very much for having me here, and to you and Tarek for initiating this. I think it's an important discussion to have right now, and especially here in DC, as we think about what's actually happening on the ground in Egypt in terms of human rights. And obviously in terms of the human rights situation, you all follow Egypt, and you know that we've gone through different phases. So we had a year and a half of military rule, and that brought with it its own set of abuses. And I think the second phase that we're in now started in, let's say, August 2012. And at the beginning, I was very much in the wait-and-see camp in terms of certain human rights issues. I felt that based on the discourse of the Freedom and Justice Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, that we had grounds to be very concerned about women's rights, about freedom of expression, about freedom of religion. But on other issues, and in particular police abuse and military trials of civilians, I thought there were some grounds for us to believe for us to be cautiously optimistic in the sense that these were issues that the Brotherhood themselves had campaigned against for years. And it was in that capacity that at Human Rights Watch that we first got to know the Brotherhood as campaigners against torture, as campaigners against military trials of civilians. But I think that cautious optimism was sort of ended really with the crisis of November and December. And I think, I don't know how it was perceived from the outside, but we're still suffering the consequences of that major turning point in Egypt, because that was the moment that broke the political process, that created this extreme polarization, this lack of trust, a first clear move of authoritarianism, the first clear disruption to the quality of the transition by the Morsi government. And when one looks at the responses by the US government and by the European Union to that moment of crisis, I think that goes a long way to explaining why there is a perception right now that the United States is biased towards the Muslim Brotherhood, or is back in the mold of supporting what some analysts are calling authoritarian stability at the expense of supporting human rights in Egypt. I think when we look at the months we had in the run-up to November, many of us in the human rights community were documenting the same police abuse that we've been documenting over the last couple of years. And the responses that we were getting from presidency officials or from other FJP officials is that we're very serious about police reform, but it's going to take a generation and give us time, or other arguments that include the bureaucracy is against us, or we don't have a legislator right now, so we can't undertake radical reforms. But I think what soon became clear from in particular December onwards, but let's take January, let's take the response to Port Said as an indicator of the presidency's position on police abuse and police reform. What soon became clear is that there was no intention, there is no political will to actually address reform of the security sector or the need for accountability. And we come back again and again to the issue of police abuse, not just because we're human rights activists who still care about torture, who care about excessive use of force, who care about killing of protesters, but because, if anything, January 2011 was supposed to be a wake-up call. I think people sometimes forget that on January 28th, over 90 police stations were burnt down across the country. That usually indicates that there's a problem. And the fact that 2 years later, successive administrations in Egypt haven't dealt with the need to reform the police, haven't dealt with the need to have real accountability, and that the international community so far appears to be willing to make offerings of partial training. I've heard this from various embassies around Cairo, who are sometimes shipping out Ministry of Interior generals to study tours in European capitals, and are willing to go down that route in isolation. Training is always the easy option in terms of engagement, but it doesn't address the actual need to structurally reform the system. And if we look at the response to Port Said in January 2011, when you had an attack on a prison, so some use of force on the part of protesters, but the response so incredibly disproportionate and indiscriminate that 42 people end up being killed over those 3 days. And the president's response is to, instead of saying, while saying that he upholds and wants to defend the police, but will insist on accountability, instead he then declares a state of emergency, says he stands fully behind the police, and encourages them to use force in responding to any threats to security. So the same discourse that we used to hear from Adli's Ministry of Interior, basically, and a failure to recognize that this kind of excessive response on the part of the police is a destabilizing factor. Is destabilizing to the political situation in Egypt. If you look at protests in Egypt over the last few months in particular, you will see that in many cases there is an increase in violence on the part of protesters. I mean, I don't think this is something that you're not aware of. The violence so far has been stone throwing, Molotov cocktail throwing, fairly low level. And I think that the failure to, in any way, try to rein in an excessive response on the part of the police, and the failure to hold any members of the police accountable, in and of it really leads to the sense of disillusionment with the entire political process on the part of protesters. Now, what those of us in the human rights community about a year ago or a year and a half ago were saying to protesters is, if your 17-year-old best friend was killed by the police, come to us, we'll file a complaint, we'll call for accountability, we'll pressure the government into taking accountability seriously, and there will be justice. we're almost approaching a point where you can't even sell that any longer. That doesn't resonate because there's been such impunity consistently for the last 2 years. Recently, over the last week, if you were following, sections of a fact-finding committee report were leaked to the media. This fact-finding committee was set up by Morsi in July 2012. It was one of the first things he did, and one of the reasons for that cautious optimism that I mentioned earlier. The committee completed its task at the end of December 2012, but Morsi did not make that report public. Now, that report looks at 1.5 years of police abuse against protesters up until June 2012. And the whole point of a fact-finding report is to report on the facts, to make the facts public. And we've consistently argued that victims and victims' families have a right to truth. This report would be the first official acknowledgement by the Egyptian state that the police is responsible for using excessive force against protesters. And even that, the president has not done so far. He's been unwilling to make public a report that looks at the period before his reign. Of course, the report also looks at military abuse, which is a contributing factor. If you remember, the military killed 27 Christian protesters at Maspero, images of the woman in the blue bra in December 2011 being stamped on by military officers, torture, virginity tests in March 2011, all that long list is in the report, and of course there's been no real accountability for any of those incidents. But even the police abuse sections of those reports haven't been made public. And so I am very afraid that we're facing a situation now where there's failure to recognize that there needs to be reform of the police, that you cannot reform the police by a little bit of training and isolation without any real accountability. And accountability doesn't have to mean 700 generals being tried for torture or excessive use of force. It could mean 3 or 4 key prosecutions to send a message of deterrence. And yet even that hasn't been happening yet. And that fundamentally concerns me in terms of political stability moving forward, the kind of economic reforms that are being proposed. If the IMF loan happens, that will bring about tax and subsidy reforms, which will cause more social unrest. What kind of police force do you have to deal with that? And what kind of police force do you have that, what you ideally need to move it to a point where police force will not kill protesters for using excessive force on every occasion? The second sort of basket of issues that I am very concerned about and that I think should inform US and EU policy towards Egypt at this point is the fact that there are threats to political space to organize moving forward. Now, I sometimes hear the argument from diplomats at the Cairo level that, well, the opposition is disorganized, or we're hearing conflicting messages, or, well, we've got to wait for them to get their act together before we really decide to promote democracy and human rights proactively. So we're just going to take a back seat, and I think that may have been partially what informed the very bad response on the part of the US and the EU to the November Constitutional Declaration. But that argument is fundamentally problematic because it assumes that unless there is a unified opposition that says the kind of things that foreign policymakers want to hear, then there is no obligation on the EU or the US to promote human rights proactively. And instead, one of the arguments that I keep making is that you can de-link your assessment of the political situation with your obligation to ensure that governments protect political space for the opposition to organize longer term. And I would argue that if you look at freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association, we're already seeing threats to all of those rights. So on freedom of expression, prosecution of journalists on the grounds of insulting the president or insulting the judiciary. In some cases, the presidency has actually initiated many of these complaints. In others, they argue that these are complaints filed by private citizens. Now, as we all know, the FJP controls the Shura Council and can pass any legislation it wants. And we keep trying to argue that if you don't allow political criticism, if you don't protect the space for political criticism, then you can't claim to be, democratic. And the fact that the Minister of Justice has actually appointed an investigative judge who so far summoned 17 journalists, including high-profile talk show hosts, on charges of insulting the judiciary, shows you how the Mubarak legal framework is being used to attempt to limit the space that we have right now for criticism, which is really in the private media. You've also, I'm sure, heard about the NGO law. There's been a lot of lack of clarity about which NGO law is on the books, but right now what we know is that the Shura Council is discussing an NGO law which was originally a Freedom and Justice draft, but was merged with a Ministry of Social Affairs draft, and that this draft is of extreme concern to all of us in the human rights community, but also many in the development community, because it provides additional restrictions on the existing NGO law. And I think INGOs in particular are specifically threatened by this new NGO law, because the NGO law stipulates that INGOs' activities must conform with the priorities of Egyptian society, which could mean anything in the world. It also stipulates that INGOs cannot receive government funding directly or indirectly or be associated with political parties in their home country. I think clearly a reference to the NGO crisis of the last year and a half. Beyond that, we've also seen an extremely restrictive demonstrations law tabled, and a refusal to pass a trade unions law that would finally recognize the over 800 trade unions that have attempted to register in name but have no legal protection. And I urge you not to forget about the trade unions when we talk about freedom of association, because that's an important space to watch moving forward in terms of the demands for social justice. So I think we're not in a place where international actors are incapable of promoting human rights. I think we're still at a point where the Egyptian government is actually very outward-looking and very sensitive to international criticism. Otherwise, they wouldn't be constantly on the phone to foreign journalists who publish critical articles, and they wouldn't be approaching international organizations like us or like Amnesty when we put out reports. And I think this opportunity for leverage is in the first couple of years, while the administration is still outward-looking, because if you set up the relationship and so that it's business as usual, and business as usual meaning seeing Egypt in terms of supporting a central government for purposes of geostrategic stability, or on the grounds that you believe that unconditional or less critical support to that government will bring stability, I think that's a very short-sighted strategy, and I would just go back to trying to remember the lessons of January 2011, which I think neither the Egyptian government nor many international actors have been listening to carefully enough so far.
Thank you very much. Mahmoud?
How do I follow that? Okay, so 10 days ago, there has been a declaration by the Minister of Interior, which he announced it after being sick of clashes happening at the Asr Nil Bridge in downtown Cairo by young boys, teenagers, between the ages of 14 and 17, that he now empowers Egyptians to have the ability to do citizens' arrests. So he encouraged people to go down to the street and citizen arrest anyone that they consider to be thuggish. 2 days ago, in Suez, two self-appointed members of the the Prevention of Vice and the Promotion of Virtue group in Egypt, an Islamic group, tried to do that in Suez. They tried to actually stop a woman from walking down the street while wearing a dress that isn't exactly Islamic. The people have responded by beating them to a pulp. Yesterday in Shar'iyya and in Gharbiya, two separate incidences in which in Gharbiya and Samanud they managed to get two guys who stole a ricochet car, and they basically executed a public lynching, which the video is all over the internet and the pictures of it is all over the internet. In Shar'iyya, there was a driver who ended up hitting another car and killing someone, and he was taken to the police station, and the family members of the dead guy went in and stormed in the police station, and not only did they beat up the police and held them hostage, they also beat up the guy and held them hostage, and no one was able to do anything about it. We juxtapose this to what's happening in Mu'attab for the past 48 hours in Cairo, where the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood, which isn't really a legal entity in any way, shape, or form in Egypt, has had a number of clashes because the number of protesters went near there and wanted to do some graffiti close to where the building is, and somehow the members of Muslim Brotherhood came out and they beat them up, and then next thing you know, the police are going there and beating down the protesters for the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, interestingly enough, the Muslim Brotherhood does not, as as anything, as an organization, has no legal entity. For them to even have that kind of building with that kind of sign would be, against the law in every way, shape, or form, which would be the case. They would be prosecuted for it if it wasn't for the fact that we have an attorney general who was illegally appointed by President Morsi during the constitutional crisis, and Minister of Interior, who was also shouldn't be there, who is also very much a Muslim loyalist, and therefore we are facing a situation where the rule of law doesn't really matter. Now, while this is happening, President Morsi, 72 hours ago, decided that he wants to go to Upper Egypt, one of the areas in which he still enjoys supposedly some popularity. And he decided he's going to have an event in Sohag, and he's going to go to a stadium, and he's going to meet with the people, and everybody will be happy to see him, and it will show his support. People in Sohag were so happy that he was there, they couldn't wait to get their hands on him, to the point in which they tore down the stadium trying to catch him, and he had to escape the governorate with his teeth. This is, that means that Sohag now can be added to the list of governorates in which Morsi cannot show his face publicly or even hold a public event, including Cairo, Alexandria, Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. Now we have Upper Egypt in Sohag. So now not only do we have the North Coast, we have the center, do we have the Red Sea side and the Suez side, we also have Upper Egypt. So it's very interesting because they keep reminding us that he has legitimacy and he's in power, and we should all follow his rule of law. But yeah, he doesn't really believe in that. And not only he doesn't believe in that, we are starting to see a very interesting pattern here, in which the government is unable to exercise its power increasingly all over Egyptian governorates, and it's not doing so because people are thuggish or because people don't want to see the implementation of the law, but it's because people have lost faith in the law altogether. And we have seen this actually all the way up from the days of the constitutional referendum for the constitution. One of the things that very few people noticed was that in a constitution that was very divisive on all fronts, and in which it was dubbed the Sharia constitution, and you actually had to go and vote yes for the constitution or else Sharia will fall apart, 68% of Egyptian voters didn't even bother to go. And the reason why they didn't even bother to go is because they didn't believe in the legitimacy of the elections. They didn't believe that the ballot box would matter. They didn't believe that if you put your vote in, it will actually count. And this brings us to the opposition and their position to not wanting to engage in the parliamentary elections. And it's not because they are weak and disorganized or whatever, even though they are. But at the end of the day, as we all know, all elections are local. And if what's necessary is candidates, and if what's necessary is money, the money is there, the candidates are there. That's not even the problem. The problem lies in the fact that even those candidates with those money are not even sure that if they put their money in, that their money will not be wasted, because they have now a justice minister who is Muslim Brotherhood, they have a minister of interior who is Muslim Brotherhood, they have the ability to affect voter rolls, they have the ability to affect how the ballots are being moved and transported. They have 1,000,001 ways to fulfill a legacy that Mubarak left behind of forgery and voter manipulation, voter fraud, in which no actual change has actually happened to. And they don't seem intent to do anything about it. So here we're facing a very interesting situation. We have 3 ways to affect change peacefully. The first one is protesting. And so far, the Morsi government is not interested. The second way is through judiciary. And the Morsi government has managed to break the judiciary. It has managed to not only lay siege to the Constitutional Court at the time of the constitutional referendum to prevent it from actually stopping the referendum, but it also added specific conditions inside the new constitution just to remove the single woman in the Constitutional Court that existed, and just because they just couldn't deal with the idea that she was there. And it had taken away all of its teeth. Now it has more of a consulting role instead of actually the role it had before, which was the ability to strike down law completely. So even that is gone. And what's left is elections, which are the best way to do conflict resolution, in a peaceful way. And even that has lost all legitimacy. So in their effort to solidify their rule and make sure that they are powerful and unquestioned, they actually left no place for any other political actor except violence. And while the people at the NSF are not going to go the route of violence, and therefore are becoming more and more marginalized, the majority of the Egyptian population, who are more and more suffering economically, lacking in political representation, lacking in any kind of results by any of the political actors, they're slowly but surely descending into that direction. Now, if you add to it the fact that we are seeing a delay in the parliamentary elections, because even in the ability to, and it's one of those beautiful things when you see the Muslim Brotherhood having all the power in the world. They have set up the entire system for their benefit. They even created an entire legislative, body, the Shura Council, which is 90% appointed by the president of his own people to pass any kind of law he wants. And they still manage to produce bad laws. They still manage to produce laws that would be struck at any court down, which was what happened with the election law, which is why we end up having our election postponed. And the election postponement causes a big problem, because until they actually finish with the election law, the timing where that leaves you to have elections mean that our elections are going to be postponed all the way till beginning of September, because Ramadan is in the middle of the summer, and we can't have elections through Ramadan. So we will not end up having an actual parliamentary body up until September, October, which, in case anybody has paid attention to the Egyptian revolution, is what we like to call the revolutionary season, because in October we do have the Maspero anniversary. In November we do have in October, Maspero, November what? Egyptian, Muhammad Mahmoud, December, Egyptian cabinet, January, Jan 25, February for Said. So things are gonna heat up again. In the words of Game of Thrones, winter is coming. And that's what will happen. And this is passing through an entire summer in which the country has no dollars. It is not able to actually deal with the rolling blackouts that are going to happen. It's not going to be able to subsidize the food that needs to be subsidized. They're not going to have the money to subsidize the fuel that needs to be subsidized, or even buy the fuel, and sell it at the regular price. So it's getting to be very interesting to watch, because situation, if you sit down with the NSF leaders, even they will agree the situation is out of everybody's hands now. That old saying that Egypt is too big to fail? No, Egypt is too big to save at this point. And one has to wonder, what are we going to do? Because the lack of any kind of international pressure on Morsi, the international praise that was lavished upon Morsi for the ability to enact a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel, which gave him the political clout internationally to actually go ahead and impose that constitutional declaration that has allowed him to do all of those things that he has done, which has brought us to this point, is leaving us in a place in which we don't know what can be done. Egypt's in God's hands now. It's not even in the army's hands now. And if anybody thinks that the army has the ability to save Egypt single-handedly in the wake of that there are no political actors that can, well, the army is not going to do that either. Because what the army does is that it goes down and puts its bases all over and protects its interests, but it won't actually get involved. And we have seen its inability to control or impact law and order over the years of over the month of the military rule. And in actuality, I saw a fantastic picture in Suez while they were there to enact the ceasefire and bring out the peace. And the soldiers of the military were there building a new supermarket. Because, while they're there, they might as well expand their economic interests and make more money. I'm not sure what can be done at this point, honestly. But we are watching an ever-shrinking government. We are watching a situation in which this government will either fall apart or will end up being nothing but a symbolic government that has actually no control over the country, and in which has turned the entire country into, take your example, anywhere from Nigeria, Brazil, Haiti, whatever, which is insane when you think that it's a country of 95 million people. So I'm not sure what can be done at this point. I'm not sure if there is any pressure that can be done on Morsi at this point either. But when he came into power, he called his project the Renaissance Project. And if this is what his Renaissance looks like, I'm really wondering what the Dark Ages looks like to him. Thank you.
Thank you. Tarek?
Well, thank you both for an extremely sobering view of Egypt. I mean, obviously, Egypt is struggling at this point. There's no doubt about that. I want to just quickly comment on a few things that Heba mentioned, that right now Egypt is experiencing the consequences of the presidential decree in November and the violence in December. I might actually argue that it started even earlier than that. That it started. This entire breakdown started with the dissolution of Parliament, and this is, I think, where the judiciary started to play a more political role rather than they began straying away from the adherence to strict law and really wanted to govern this transition as much as any other of these deep state branches of government that continue to look for their interests. The MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, it's clear that the Morsi government has wanted to co-opt the security forces before any attempt to do any kind of security reform. I agree that there's no political will, but part of this is that the Morsi government is really insecure about its own control, and it really wants to ingratiate itself to those resistant bodies that it relies on to maintain control of the country. This was a mistake, flat out. The Morsi government, instead of relying on that, should have relied on the revolutionary fervor, the demand for change, the demand for justice and accountability. It's a very costly mistake. And as a result, what we've seen is the police forces going out in a strike, the biggest strike since 1986. And they've essentially delivered the message to Morsi that if you don't give us the status that we had in the pre-revolution era, the ability to go out and deal with security the way we want to deal with security, you will have no security on the streets. And this is an extremely dangerous time. Going to the issue of free press and journalism, yes, definitely there has been an attack on journalists over the years. But this is the interesting thing here is the lines between the Morsi government all the way down to these private citizens and in between the Muslim Brotherhood are extremely blurred. We've seen the Muslim Brotherhood come out and give official statements. In what capacity do they give these statements is unclear. And as a result, it's unclear who we're dealing with exactly. Are we dealing with the Morsi administration? Are these the people we should be bringing human rights issues up to their attention? Or should we be dealing with Muslim Brotherhood leadership? It's unclear, and I think Abdul Fattah today came, either today or yesterday, came out and said that the Muslim Brotherhood should exit politics. And I couldn't agree more. This kind of confusion makes it extremely unclear who's in charge. The fact that the Morsi government is an outward-looking government does give us hope, though. It does mean that international pressure can bring results. And as a matter of fact, we've seen that. We've seen that in the Council on the Status of Women, for instance, where the Muslim Brotherhood, they condemned the statement in the effort to protect against violence against women. And Mahmoud, you wrote an excellent article on Egypt Source that outlines the outrageous claims that were made. But the kind of backlash, the immediate backlash against that, mostly international, as well as within, I'll be fair, within Egypt as well, it forced President Morsi to come out with a statement reaffirming his commitment to stopping violence against women. That among those things, among the pressures on the Morsi government was also the European Parliament. And the European Parliament, they came out with a statement, and they threatened to withhold the $5 billion in aid that was allocated for the fiscal year 2012-2013 in budget support. This shows you two things, really. It shows you how a significant portion of aid can affect what's happening on the ground in Egypt, at least rhetorically, maybe not on the ground. We have yet to see whether or not the right legislation will be written. But for instance, the law on sexual harassment is in the works. There are steps that are being taken, and I think a lot of this is due to this kind of pressure. They've sent Assam al-Haddad, Morsi's foreign policy advisor, to Berlin to do damage control, to try and sell the idea that, yes, the democratic process is moving forward and the need for aid is dire. Again, this shows you what $5 billion can do. The United States, unfortunately, does not have that same kind of pull because it doesn't have as much invested beyond the military assistance that is going towards it. It's almost completely separate from the economic assistance that would have more of a social influence than it otherwise does right now. Of course, to be fair, the U.S. relationship is also more complex. The strategic interests are more hard security related, and certainly towards Israel, of course. But the U.S. has also not, the Obama administration has been silent when it should have spoken out, and has spoken out when it should have stayed silent. Of course, the most obvious example is during the November presidential decree. This is a time when the U.S. certainly should have condemned that kind of decision. But when it also spoke out, it spoke out in with regard to partaking in elections. And to be fair, this was a State Department spokesperson who said this, but the fact is that it was an implicit siding with the Morsi government as opposed to a neutral statement. The best thing that I think Europe is taking the right steps. And I think Kerry is beginning to take the right steps. But I think if the U.S. wants to be a more significant player in terms of influence on human rights and rule of law, it really needs to step up and contribute more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers. Looking for some bright spot. Maybe we'll find this in the Q&A. Before I open it up to all of you, I wanted to ask one question. This topic is so multifaceted. There's so many threads to it, and I just want to focus for a minute on one particular thread, which is the situation of human rights defenders in Egypt, those Egyptians who are working to expose and work against and bring accountability for human rights abuses. What is their situation? What is their morale? Is it basically the same group of people? How significant are new activists? And to what extent do each of you see the proposed draft new NGO law in part as targeting the work of those people as well as having other motives? So why don't I just start with that question, and we'll open it up to the group.
I mean, I think the draft legislation is very, very bad news. I can't underestimate how serious this is. There's been confusion about which draft and whether it'll move forward, and a lot of conflicting statements by the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. But the last news we know from last week, a group of European diplomats met Assam al-Arian, who said within the next 3 to 4 weeks we'll be moving forward with this draft. And the reason it does target the human rights community in particular is that the lifeline of the human rights community under Mubarak was always foreign funding. In the aftermath of the revolution, people did try to seek Egyptian funding, but very quickly the NGO investigation started in July 2011, and so there weren't local sources basically willing to fund human rights groups. So if you put permission to receive foreign funding in the hands of Egyptian general intelligence, which is what is being proposed right now in the law. If you insist that all funds of Egyptian NGOs are considered public funds, and then obviously if you criminal or prohibit any interaction with foreign entities, including foreign NGOs, to Egyptian organizations, you're really constraining. You're almost handing them over to the security services, who initially were always in charge of them, but slightly more in the background under Mubarak. You're formalizing an already problematic situation, and I think that that's very oppressive for the human rights community, who were hoping to finally register. Nobody liked being unregistered under Mubarak because it meant that you were vulnerable to arbitrary decision making by the government to shut you down. So I think that's been key for the existing human rights NGOs which we have already. The other problem is that what we had in the immediate aftermath of the revolution was loads and loads of civil society initiatives, various activist groupings, grassroots initiatives, but also youth groups coming together and trying to organize. And I think that the NGO investigation and the smear campaign accompanying it had a deterrent effect on those groups, and very few of them have actually survived. I mean, one of the few examples is perhaps the No to Military Trials campaign, which campaigns against military trials of civilians. And the only reason they've survived is that they're groupings and they have support from some human rights organizations to back them up. But otherwise, I can't really talk about groupings of human rights defenders outside the formal human rights NGO community that have sustained their activism over the last 2 years. So I think the legislation is going to be crucial. And the other space to watch out for are potential prosecutions in relation to expression. But so far we haven't seen that, at least with the human rights community.
Would you like to add to that?
As far as I know, that so far they have touted 4 different NGO laws, and there seems to be that one is horrific, one is ideal, and then there are 2 that are very, wish-washy. One of them is what the Muslim Brotherhood wants, and they're basically the deal is that they're going to go with the really scary one, and then they're going to push for the other one, which isn't really ideal, which isn't exactly what we would like, but however, it's better than nothing. However, 2 things. The Muslim Brotherhood does not like the idea of NGOs fighting for human rights, because as we have seen, they tip their hand when it comes to women's rights, at least. They don't think married women should be allowed to file rape grievances against their husbands if they rape them. They don't think that women should be allowed to travel, work, or use contraception without their husband's permission. They don't exactly believe the idea that women or men are equal at all. So, and one cannot separate the concept of women's rights from human rights. And in that sense, they're not very big on people who are human rights defenders in general. And that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is the same way that the previous regime has looked at it, which is why they set up the Ministry of International Development and Cooperation, which is there is money coming into Egypt. And if there is money coming into Egypt, it is better that we, or people associated with us, take the money than other people that don't like us take the money. So what Faiza Bunnaga, ex-Minister Faiza Bunnaga, used to do was that she would take the money in, and then very few people would be able to get the money themselves if they're on the opposite side of the Mubarak regime. But the MDP had created 600,000 other NGOs who did nothing, who would just get the money instead from the Ministry of Development, and that would just, enrich a culture of corruption that is, that makes the civil society, that gives civil society in Egypt a bad name for the most part. And while the NDP has gone away, there is a number. The Muslim Brotherhood are facing an issue of financing, and they need to sustain social services in order to secure people's loyalties for elections. And that money coming in would be a fantastic way for them to actually provide that. And they would like that money for themselves. So they'll make sure that this ministry does not allow the money to come in legally, which means that many of those NGOs are going to face serious problems surviving, and many of them are already suffering because a lot of their money come out of the grants that they win, come in through the government, and then it stops at the government and they don't see it at all. So on one aspect, I don't foresee anything good happening in terms of that NGO law. I don't think that even if they pass the regular good NGO law, they're still going to control the money fountain, and they're going to kill any NGO they don't like by simply denying the money from coming into that NGO from outside. And that's going to be their tactic. I don't know, Heba, do you agree?
I mean, I just disagree on the 4 drafts thing because we've moved beyond that.
Okay.
We know that there is one draft, which is this merged FJP and Ministry of Social Affairs draft, and we've been, talking to Shura members. So that's the law that's moving forward.
That's the horrible one? Okay.
Yeah.
But in terms of the financials?
Yeah, no, the financials, obviously.
Yeah. So that's what they're going to do.
Okay, why don't we open it up to everyone's questions? If you would do the speakers the courtesy of identifying yourself and giving your affiliation. And there's going to be a microphone that you can speak into right there.
I have a question. I remember right after the revolution, and the reform, the new face of it as an Al-Watani, it was very surprising to see, we're seeing a new form of interface. And rights organization, when they invited us for a private briefing and telling us all, how they're going to change and have a different approach to everything. And although no one in the room was naive enough to believe that this is actually going to happen, but it was a good sign that at least they want to keep a good face. At least they want to appear to be democratic and reforming and everything. I just want to ask you now, about 2 things. What are the form of interaction and interface between the government and the rights organizations now? Do they still do these briefings? Are they still keen to communicate with you? And are they still keen to keep a good face? And what is the form of communication? Are they listening more or giving more? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Access is definitely better. Especially in the last 2 years, but also in the last few months. So, for example, the presidency via Sam Haddad's office, because they're international affairs, have invited Egyptian NGOs for a meeting, for an initial meeting. This was last month. I've also met with them, and Amnesty International has also had access to them. I recently met with the Assistant Ministry of Interior for Human Rights, who doesn't do very much, but does human rights training. But at least, you can meet with, the Ministry of Interior is not really the seat of power that it once was. I think that's why access is easy to them. The Ministry of Justice is interesting because Minister Mickey actually reached out to us to comment on the demonstrations law, to us and to Amnesty and to the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies and OHCHR, and that openness is not necessarily a sign of a desire to substantively engage, but is significant in terms of, I think, an opportunity for various civil society actors to at least have input into whatever, the drafts at the beginning, because honestly, once they go into the shura, they're likely to become much more restrictive in many ways. And access to parliamentarians, in the parliament in 2012, most of us had good access to the Human Rights Committee, but I'm not sure how. I'm not sure whether that would be repeated with the next parliament or not. It really depends on who the committee chairs are and what their policy is. In terms of the substance, access definitely better. That's different. In terms of the substance of engagement, that really ultimately depends on who you're sitting with. Sometimes if you can convince a parliamentarian on an informal basis that this is consistent with international law, or that this is best practice. Sometimes they run with those arguments, but it will never be a public. So I think there's some quiet technical assistance that's really happening from a lot of organizations at the Cairo level to a limited extent. But with the presidency, it's difficult. I mean, again, in October, and November, I was making a lot of recommendations and short and medium-term recommendations on various human rights issues, and I wasn't the only one on that. And we, towards the end of that experience, we sensed that this was not really a substantive engagement where there was listening, but there wasn't really an opportunity to influence policy making in that way.
Okay, why don't we take a question in the back there?
Hi, I'm Mira Maddy with the National Endowment for Democracy. My question, actually building on Amy and Nancy's question, is what tools are at the disposal of human rights defenders now? You talked about access to parliamentarians. What about litigation? What about the court systems? Can you give us maybe an overview, Heba, of some of the cases that are being reviewed now in Egyptian courts that are related to human rights, and how are courts ruling on these issues? Thanks.
It's a rather broad question. I mean, I think litigation's been key. The decision to grant Egyptians abroad the right to vote in elections was the result of a case brought by a human rights organization that forced the military at the last minute to scramble and make that happen. The decision by an administrative court to condemn the military for conducting virginity tests on women detainees in prisons came through a case brought by a set of human rights organizations, and I think it's important to remember, because I mean, litigation was one of the main tools that human rights organizations employed before the revolution. Mubarak would often ignore the verdicts, like the minimum wage verdict, for example, but and so we saw that trend continue. And to what extent it has an impact on policy is unclear, really. It depends on the particular issue. I think it's just important to put that on the table because of this view of the judiciary as being completely pro-Mubarak. I think the judiciary is far more mixed than that. But we've also seen very conservative decisions by the judiciary in many cases. I mean, let's not forget the 38 police station trials from related to the violence in January 2011. For the most part, most of those decisions, at my last count, 29 had resulted in acquittals, with 2 people convicted and 2 other suspended sentences. I mean, even the suspended sentences where the judge says, yes, there was an excessive use on the part of the police. Yes, this exceeded self-defense. However, I'm going to apply a clemency provision due to my belief that the police officers will not commit this crime once again in the future, and issues a suspended sentence. So it's a tool that's out there, but it really depends on the judge you end up with. Other tools, I mean, right now we're back in the documentation and naming and shaming phase, unfortunately. And that's very much the sense on the part of the Egyptian human rights community, where they don't feel that engagement with policymakers is a good use of their time, and instead they feel they need to be, in Mansoura, in Port Said, just documenting what's actually happening, because you have to counter an official narrative that is so distant from reality that it seems quite surreal.
Okay, yes, right here.
I'm Zach Gold from the Saban Center at Brookings. You're both lucky to be here when now 5 different amendments are in the Senate about conditioning aid to Egypt. So I was wondering your thoughts on whether or not this is helpful. Mahmoud, obviously you've famously told the U.S. to back off in an interview. And I guess more broadly,
during the presidential elections.
More broadly, what can the administration or Congress do to change the broadly held perception that they are backing the Brotherhood versus democracy? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I do like the European approach. The more for more approach is actually something that I like, that I think it has been very successful and actually gives a very clear way forward. Linking economic aid to democratic reforms happening in the country and actually taking a step forward is actually a good thing. What we're having in the States here is another problem altogether, because the majority of the aid that comes in is military aid, and that is conditioned by 5-year contracts, and there are national interests that are very much, tied into that. And and in terms of economic aid, it's negligible. I mean, the $1 billion that even Obama offered in terms of aid to Egypt, which was supposed to be from 2 years ago or something, is actually in the form of loans. So it's not really helping that much. Pressure on the IMF at this point is not really going to get us anywhere, because the IMF does not believe, wants to ensure that the government actually have a parliament before actually signing, the deal. So since the parliament's not going to come until September, we're stuck there. I think that what we need to do is link economic assistance really to democratic reforms and pressures in terms of ensuring that you end up having with a government that isn't Muslim Brotherhood dominated, one that is more, or at least not even the entire government, but very specific cabinets. Having neutral people or technocrats being on the helms of those governorates. Ministries, I mean. And I think that if you manage to do this and at the same time push for some sort of national reconciliation that's linked to the aid money, then we're actually going to see something happen. But let me inform you of something in which, as much as that in theory sounds good, here's what actually happened in Egypt when Secretary Kerry was there. Secretary Kerry could not meet with Mohammed al-Baradei, for example, from the NSF, but he made a phone call, and they had a phone call of 30 minutes in which John Kerry acted like a mediator between the opposition and and the presidency, and informing them that the Muslim Brotherhood are willing to do this, and they're willing to back down on the government and change the Attorney General, and they're going to do this and do that, and don't worry about the elections or whatever. And while he's actually telling this to Baradei, the Muslim Brotherhood goes ahead and announces the opening for the elections, door, which basically meant that whatever that Kerry was negotiating on, whatever assurances he had, they basically burnt him when it came to the opposition. So, which I thought was very interesting, how he then promised them aid money, and then you saw that same aid money being rejected later on in the House, and it's 1-2 step that's happening in, So I'm not even sure that the US administration thinks it has the kind of leverage it's necessary, or it sees the kind of respect or commitment coming from, the Muslim Brotherhood. I think they are more likely to see any kind of cooperation from the military, which they have had a more trusted relationship with. But at the same time, you don't want to get the military involved really in this situation, because every time they get involved, it doesn't end up in any good way. So I'm not really sure if there is anything that can be done on the national level. I think what would be more interesting would be seeing specific programs that target economic development in specific areas, that aim to protect at least specific things. I'm seriously worried about our pharaonic heritage at this point. I have nightmares, of watching the Great Pyramids having graffiti sprayed on them at this point, because I don't think that they are worried too much about protecting it. You're seeing lots of pharaonic heritage being stolen, vandalized, and we do have people in government who believe that such things are idols that should be destroyed. So such programs for me personally are more of a priority, but I don't think anything else at this point can actually be effective. We'll have to wait until the complete breakdown, at least, of the summer happens, and that's when you can actually pressure them, because Qatar has said that they're not even interested in giving them any more money.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Perhaps just in brief, I mean, I agree that, conditioning or adding human rights conditionality to military aid is not a particularly effective way, because it's not like we're going to ask the military to pressure the Morsi administration to improve its human rights record. But I think there should be questions about what the U.S. is investing in terms of its military, and I think Nancy made a very convincing argument a couple of months ago about rethinking and restructuring US aid. I think the economic situation is dire, and I would never be in favor of cutting off economic assistance at this point, because I think it's the Egyptian people who will suffer. I think we should remember that social justice was one of the main reasons for the uprising. However, I don't think we can go back to the 2010 situation of giving aid strings free, because I don't think that that's good for Egypt, and I don't think that that's good for the US. I think if you want political stability in Egypt, it needs to have a minimum of buy-in. If you want a government that can implement difficult economic decisions or even difficult foreign policy decisions, that government needs to have enough buy-in to be able to implement those decisions. It needs to have an effective police force that doesn't run around killing people and igniting more protests. And political buy-in means protection of political space. I mean, that's why I'm making those arguments. And I think the US, all the US needs to do is to be consistent in the narrative it presents, whether that narrative comes out of the Senate, which can instruct the administration, obviously, on these issues. And I would argue that, consistency of the narrative at this early stage is key for setting the terms of the relationship moving forward.
Heba, based on what you said earlier in your remarks, it seems like you believe, and maybe you believe as well, Mahmoud, that the Egyptian presidency, at least, is very sensitive to international criticism and international views of their performance. So do you believe that if conditioning aid is a very, very blunt instrument and a difficult tool to use, that potential for influence is much more in the realm of public rhetoric, even as opposed to private diplomacy? Sort of what legitimacy the international community is giving to this government, especially based on not only international human rights standards, but its own commitments, President Morsi's own statements early in his presidency about what he wanted to do. Do you feel that that is useful, or will it produce a backlash?
I think
inside Egypt.
But I think the NGO crisis has produced this sense on the part of the U.S. that any public statement issued will be counterproductive. I get this argument sometimes, and I think that's I just don't think that's true for all statements. It really depends how you phrase things, and you can refer to general terms such as the independence of the judiciary or the importance to respect rule of law or checks and balances in responding to the November Constitutional Declaration. You don't have to just say, the international community and Egyptians and the international community are concerned. That's the kind of waffly statement that actually amounts to acquiescing or supporting the actual move. But when you come out, if you put out a public statement that's critical, you can also frame that in fairly general terms. So I've consistently argued for the last 4 years of doing advocacy at the Cairo level that unless you have public statements that back up your private engagement, you really won't be taken seriously, because private engagement can be contained, and the Egyptian MFA has a whole range of tools that it uses to great effect, and has used to great effect, to block off any international criticism. But it's the public statement backing up private diplomacy, even if the public statement is weaker and more general than whatever messages are conveyed in private, that is significant. And I think that's especially crucial at this point, because honestly, I mean, we've talked about the human rights situation so far, but there is a great potential for deterioration. And in particular for some of, again, read the statement on women's rights produced by the Muslim Brotherhood, or look at positions on other rights. And I think that's something that needs to be factored in very early on.
I think it's interesting when you actually monitor their performance in terms of foreign policy. The Muslim Brotherhood really want international legitimacy. They actually seek it. And they seem to believe that they're under the impression that in order for them to do so, they need to have America's approval all the time. Need to be close to the States, which meant also being close to Israel and making sure that the Israeli border is more or less secure, acquiescing to the demands of blowing up the tunnels, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the Egyptian opposition themselves, the seemingly supportive relationship between the Obama administration and the Morsi regime makes many of them believe that it is futile to actually go against him. Because, are we really going to go against America? Like, are we going to be able to defeat America? You hear some of them saying this and you're thinking, whatever, what can be done in that? But it's also interesting because the United States backed Mubarak. And when the United States backed Mubarak and the revolution when it first started, it started against Mubarak, even with the US backing. The moment the United States started backing away from Mubarak, that also gave Egyptians the sense of, well, you see, now we don't have any cover. Now it's only us and you, and it's more of a fair fight. And I think that if the US shows the kind of noise that shows that it's backing away from backing Morsi or from backing away that government, I think that the general perception on the street is not gonna be rallying behind the president against the foreign imperialist powers as much as it's gonna be, oh, you US agent, you got sold out by your masters and now we're gonna take you out. And I think that would actually be better, or at least it will take away some of the power that he gives the illusion that he has by such US backing, which really he did kind of, at this point, I think he ran out of credit with the administration, more or less. I think the only reason why they still deal with him is because he is there and there is nothing they can do about it at the moment.
Right, and there's also the fact, which is not insignificant, that he was elected, and I think the Obama administration is reluctant to, ignore that fact. Well, that's a topic for another section.
As we just said, the reason why we're not having parliamentary elections is because the same people who are observing the Mubarak elections, or engineered, the same people who did the parliamentary elections in 2011, they're the same people who did the presidential election in 2012, they're the same people who did the constitutional referendum. So we're not really sure about anything when it comes to those elections. We know that massive fraud always happens. Let me put it to you this way. The very supposedly Islamist state of Suez, the one that supported, that actually passed through every Islamist candidate parliamentary election in 2011, is the same governorate of Suez where the people for the prevention of vice and promotion of virtue, the Islamic Salafis ones, end up getting, 7 of them end up getting really like almost lynched on the street. So I'm not really sure that everything that we have seen so far is actually indicative of anything. And this is the saddest part about the Egyptian revolution, this saddest part about the democracy experiment in Egypt, is without having an actual system that allows, and this is something actually maybe the US can do to help. Maybe the US can create another system for us that actually allows for a more transparent, election resolving, whatever. And this way we'll actually have, a more transparent system in which we can say, okay, fine, whatever, whoever has support, whoever won this one and that, it's fine, we can actually vouch for this. But until the system that we have in place is still there, there will be no conflict resolution, there will be no belief in free and fair elections, and nobody will ever believe that this guy won or this guy didn't win or whatever. And also, Morsi won technically by less than 1%. That's not exactly a mandate.
I don't think anyone's claiming as a mandate, just that he was elected by a hair.
Yeah, hair.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Yes, right over here.
Thank you. My name is Rami Yacoub. I am the former Chief of Staff for the Free Egyptians Party, currently a grad student here at American University. Thank you, both of you, Heba and Mahmoud. Mahmoud's definitely a good friend of mine. I have 3 questions, actually. First question is for Heba. So you had mentioned earlier in your talk you were talking about the fact-finding report that is, for some odd reason, has become a focus of international media, even though the local media in Egypt had been talking about it since December 2012 or January 2013. As you had mentioned, that we don't know much about it because we didn't see it. But some of the members of the fact-finding mission had discussed reports about freeing prisoners from jails during the initial 18 days of the revolution, among which are current President Morsi and other members of the Brotherhood that were freed out of a certain jail. And there are talks about that this might be the reason why this report is not being shown to the public. If you can give me your thoughts on that, Heba, if you don't mind. Also, actually, I have a question for Tarek. With regards to the dissolution of the parliament, there were reports by judges and courts that the law was flawed, the initial law that led to the dissolution of parliament. And I was wondering if you can give me your thoughts on that also, if there was anything that you thought, I mean, because you spoke about how the courts were politicized, and if that, I mean, the clear red flag that the judges gave back then to the military, to the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, if it meant anything. Finally, a question for both Mahmoud Salem and Heba. You know, for the DC folks that deal with Egypt, we all know that, I mean, let's be frank, when the Brotherhood wants to push a message out in town, they hit the town hard, they're organized, and they hit all the offices. I'm not gonna beat around the bush with that. But the opposition or freedom folks and human rights folks in Egypt are not as organized in this town. And I'd like to get Mahmoud's thoughts on this, if the opposition has been failing, and if so, what they should do. Also from Heba, if you think that, let me know your thoughts about how human rights folks in Egypt can communicate their message better here. Thank you.
Fact-finding committee? I mean, in brief, I don't think it's the prison section. I've spoken to a couple of the main members on the fact-finding committee and a couple of, and three members of the subcommittees, because every incident was assigned a subcommittee. And I don't think it's the prisons. I think it's the military. It's the identification of military responsibility, because they also managed initially to get quite a lot of information about the military's role in the cabinet violence when 17 people were killed. And initially, and I hope one day that one of them will write a biography or something about this, but because initially apparently a military general had turned up and thought this was a presidential committee, hadn't realized they would actually write a report that would in theory be made public, and so gave them all the information and was telling them about his men's morale, and so I then stationed this unit there, and then we did this to protect, so they actually got a lot of good stuff. I think that's a key part of it. I think the second part, though, is if you look at President Morsi's discourse over the last 2 months, you'll see a complete shift in how he talks about the police. We're not even getting the sort of the November and October statements of the police must respect human rights. This was a big statement in October. Where we're getting, I stand fully behind you, and then this approval of additional arms to the CSF when they demand them. So I think that's the other part of it. It's just a shift in tactics. In terms of the human rights communities, international advocacy. I know that at the Cairo level. Embassies know what's going on. They are in touch with the right people. They're getting the reports. I don't think we've seen a big investment on the part of the human rights community and international advocacy in the last 2 years, but probably because, relatively speaking, if you'd asked me last year, I would have invested most of my time in dealing with the Egyptian media or the Egyptian parliamentarians, because I didn't feel, just in terms of how to make impact. Whereas now, I think many people are increasingly convinced, in particular in the aftermath of November and December, that, relatively speaking, international actors have more influence. And so we're seeing an increased shift also in terms of the attention on the part of Egyptian human rights organizations. But I think Egyptians abroad are the best people who can do some of that channeling as well. So,
yeah, in terms of the opposition, you are privy to you actually saw a very old fight that I had about a year ago. About a year ago, I was in the same party that Rami was in, I quit. And I quit around the same time. I quit 1 year ago specifically over that issue. We had a person in the political office who was responsible for international outreach and international affairs. And his idea of doing so was going through embassy dinners in Cairo and drinking with whatever. He would not bother going to the States. He would not bother going to any country in Europe. He would not bother trying to approach any of the many people who tried to offer to create lobbies with them or for them or even for the opposition in any way, shape, or form. And somehow, even though that has cost us in terms of legitimacy here, because it allowed the Muslim Brotherhood a free range to actually run around and say that the liberals are as extremist and as unreliable as the Salafis, which was, an interesting statement to make, and amazingly enough, it sold with the Obama administration. I think what we're about to see is a different shift in that. I think I'm not sure that we have to rely on the opposition in Egypt as much anymore, or depending on those leaders in Egypt as much anymore, because I think there are too many people who are here and in Europe and in very specific areas who are very much interested and invested at this point, because they're watching their country competing with Afghanistan at this point in terms of future outlook. So I think many of them are actually gonna get their act together independently even from the opposition in Cairo or opposition in Egypt. I'm not sure if that's going to be good in terms of message coordination. However, given that there isn't really any kind of message coming out of Cairo towards international actors to begin with, I guess having something is better than having nothing. So that's what I think about that.
Just very quickly with regard to my comment on the courts was sort of the beginning of the breakdown. This polarized society that's led to violence in the streets and so forth. I'm not saying that the courts did not have a legal reasoning for it. However, that it is exactly that politicization. So the courts dissolved the parliament on the basis that the principle of equality was violated. So the party lists and the individual seats were not conducted on an equal basis, and that was the flaw in the elections law. And on that basis, they dissolved the People's Assembly. I will still argue to this day that they exceeded their mandate by dissolving the entire People's Assembly. I think they could have re-elected a portion of it. There's a lot of legal ambiguity throughout this entire process, and that was a time where they could have taken a prudent move to minimize the damage done to removing the entire People's Assembly. But I do think that we have seen time and time again that it's that action that has sort of almost forced Morsi in a position, or not forced him, but at least provided him the opportunity to make the kinds of moves that we object to today.
Yes, Ricky.
Ricky Goldstein, Human Rights Watch. What readings do you have of the verdicts in the soccer stadium case? Seen from the outside, it appeared that the case against the scores of people from Port Said, soccer fans, who were convicted and sentenced to long sentences for the killings of the Ahli, the Cairo supporters, a couple of years ago in their stadium, was not based on a lot of evidence. And again, seen from the outside, it looked as if this was a political verdict to calm the street and dictated by the mob, or they got political instructions to keep the Cairo fans from reacting. That's just seen from the outside. And if this is true, then is this a new threat to judicial independence in Egypt, or is this just continuation of poorly constructed verdicts that go back to the Mubarak era, or am I reading much too much into this incident?
Here's the problem with that verdict, is that after you received it, you still didn't know what exactly happened in Port Said or how that crime actually took place. For example, there was about, I believe, six police officers, six different police officers who were charged with crimes. And only, I think two of them, or one of them, was it two? Two of the top guys, basically, who end up being accused of anything. Now, interestingly, the two top guys, one of them is the head of security in Port Said. And unless, and he's not exactly the kind of person who would actually go and weld the doors himself to prevent the fans from coming out. And the person who was in charge of the door security and the person who would be able to do so actually got acquitted. Which means that legally speaking in Egypt, if that guy got an acquittal and that guy got charged for a crime, when it comes down for the appeal, the top guy will get an appeal and walk free. Which, here's the issue. The judiciary in Egypt, there is a human factor to this. The judiciary in Egypt are not exactly protected by the law. As we said, there is no rule of law. The police aren't really going to protect them. So when they're facing such a verdict, they do have two options. The first one is to rely on the evidence given to them, which necessarily isn't which is gathered by the police and by the judiciary, which isn't exactly the best evidence, at which point they would actually have to let go all the police, and then they'll accuse of being corrupt. Or they will go with their new motto, which is just give a faulty verdict and let the appeals court deal with it. Just pass the buck, which is exactly what they have done. They have given a verdict that they know isn't really gonna hold, and that the people the people in the police or whatever are actually gonna walk away free. But at least in front of everybody, it looks like they're the judges who gave the verdict to the police, and knowing that's not really gonna stick, and it's no longer their problem. It's a problem of someone else's. And it was also done in order to appease the ultras, who for the previous weeks, whatever, have said that they are gonna do some very bad things if they don't get that kind of verdict. Unfortunately, when the verdict came out, they're not exactly stupid. So while some of their leaders decided that the verdict is good enough, because for them it was mostly about getting vengeance on the people of Port Said, not really the police. Lots of the youth actually ran around throughout Cairo that day, and they burned the football union, and they stole all kinds of trophies, and they burned the police club. They just went into anarchy and chaos. So I'm not sure that even that works, but we are talking about desperate times and desperate people. And they are going to do whatever is necessary in the security vacuum that Egypt is experiencing right now to actually survive the day, including the judiciary.
Could I add a very quick footnote to that? I think one of the problematic things about the whole case of Port Said is that it shows you the pressures on the judiciary, because this was a completely ridiculous investigation, far too short. I mean, this kind of stadium killings could take over a year to investigate properly what actually really happened, and they had about 2 months. Because of the pressure from the ultras, it was referred to court very quickly. The same thing that happened with the January 2011 violence. So you have pressure on prosecutors for a speedy referral, and then pressure on the judges, and a completely politicized verdict. They clearly decided that they could deal with violence in Port Said as opposed to violence in Zamalek when they first made that death sentence, because you don't get this kind of mass sentencing to death. Very, very uncommon. And I agree that I think it'll definitely be overturned on appeal. But it brings us back to the problem where now you have this perception, both on the part of liberal activists and sort of revolutionary activists, and on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood, that if you want the verdict to go in the way that you want, you camp out outside the court. And judges are terrified in Egypt right now. And this is one of the things that they've been pushing since 2011 for a new judicial authority law, for amendments. I mean, not that would necessarily deal with security, but that when we talk about the need for independence of the judiciary, there are measures that could be taken, and one of them would be issuing this law, which is something that many of the judges' clubs were involved in drafting. But first Parliament in 2012, and now Shura, are refusing to issue that law at this point, which would go some way towards protecting this opportunity for politicization, for further politicization of the judiciary. And I think, unfortunately, there again, we're in it'll have a sort of a knock-on effect in terms of how the judiciary is perceived going forward and what people think they need to do to get the right kind of decision, with dangerous implications moving forward for respect for the rule of law.
And there's no shortage of important cases coming up that could be subject to this kind of pressure. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers for a very sobering but extremely rich and informative discussion today. Thank you very much.